Sarah Mitchell stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting her navy blue blazer one last time. At 42 years old, she had worked incredibly hard to reach her position as Senior Vice President at Global Tech Solutions. Her reflection showed a confident woman with clear brown eyes, natural hair styled in a neat bun, and a determined expression that had become her trademark. The morning sun was just beginning to rise over the city as her driver, James, pulled up to her penthouse apartment in a sleek black SUV. Sarah had learned long ago that being early was being on time, and being on time was being late. Today's meeting in Chicago was too important to risk any delays. "Good morning, Ms. Mitchell," James said, holding the car door open. He had been her driver for the past 5 years and knew her schedule better than anyone. "Beautiful day for flying." Sarah smiled and nodded, checking her phone one last time. 3 urgent emails had already arrived, despite the early hour. As the car moved smoothly through the morning traffic, she responded to each one with practiced efficiency. Her team knew that even when she was traveling, she remained fully connected and in charge. 30 minutes later, they arrived at Elite Aviation Terminal, a private facility Sarah had used countless times over the past 15 years. The familiar sight of private jets lined up on the tarmac usually filled her with excitement. Today was no different. She loved flying private, not just for the convenience, but for what it represented. She had earned this privilege through years of dedication and excellence. As James unloaded her overnight bag, Sarah straightened her posture and walked toward the terminal entrance. Her heels clicked confidently against the polished floor as she pushed through the glass doors. The modern lobby welcomed her with its usual quiet elegance, leather seats, fresh flowers, and the gentle sound of classical music playing in the background. Several other executives were already present, some she recognized from various business conferences. A few nodded in greeting, and Sarah returned their acknowledgments with a professional smile. She had learned to navigate these spaces with grace, even though she was often the only black woman in the room. Making her way to the security checkpoint, Sarah reached into her designer handbag for her identification and flight documentation. She had everything organized as always. Her pilot had already filed the flight plan, the weather report looked perfect, and her team in Chicago had confirmed all meeting arrangements. The security guard stationed at the checkpoint was someone she hadn't seen before. Thomas Reynolds, according to his name tag, was a middle-aged man with graying hair and a stern expression. Sarah noticed how his eyes narrowed slightly as she approached, but she didn't think much of it at first. After 15 years of flying private, she was used to being scrutinized. "Good morning," Sarah said pleasantly, extending her documents. Her voice carried the natural authority of someone used to leading boardroom discussions and closing multi-million-dollar deals. The time on her Cartier watch showed 6:45 a.m. Her flight was scheduled for 7:30 a.m., leaving plenty of time for the usual security procedures. Sarah could see her chartered Gulfstream G650 through the terminal windows, its pristine white exterior gleaming in the morning sun. 2 other passengers passed through security just ahead of her, both white men in business suits. Reynolds had barely glanced at their documentation before waving them through with a friendly "Have a good flight, sir." Sarah maintained her professional demeanor as she waited for Reynolds to process her documents. She had encountered subtle discrimination before, but experience had taught her to remain poised and dignified. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. Excellence is the best response to prejudice. As she stood there, Sarah reflected on her journey, from being the only black student in her private school to graduating top of her class at Harvard Business School, from her first job as a junior analyst to becoming the youngest senior VP in her company's history. She had overcome countless obstacles through determination and intelligence. Little did Sarah know that this routine business trip was about to become anything but ordinary. The next few minutes would test her composure, challenge her dignity, and ultimately lead to changes that would affect not just her life, but the entire private aviation industry. Thomas Reynolds stared at Sarah's documents longer than necessary, flipping through them back and forth. His behavior was different from just moments ago when he had quickly processed the other passengers. Sarah noticed how his jaw tightened as he looked from her photos to her face repeatedly. "Is there a problem?" Sarah asked calmly, though she could feel her heart starting to beat faster. She had been in similar situations before and knew exactly what was happening. "These can't be your documents," Reynolds said loudly, his voice carrying across the quiet terminal. This shows clearance for private aviation access. How did you get these? Several heads turned in their direction. Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her professional composure. Those are indeed my documents, Mr. Reynolds. I've been flying private for 15 years. You can verify my credentials with Elite Aviation's database. Reynolds crossed his arms, a smirk appearing on his face. Listen, maybe you're lost. The commercial terminal is 2 miles down the road. This is a private aviation facility. I'm well aware of where I am, Sarah replied firmly. She could see her pilot, Captain Anderson, walking through the terminal doors. He had flown her multiple times and would surely clear this up. But before Captain Anderson could reach them, Reynolds stepped closer to the security desk phone. I'm going to have to call this in. These documents look suspicious to me. Sarah pulled out her phone. Please do. While you're at it, I'll call Mr. James Harrison, the owner of Elite Aviation. He's on my speed dial. She wasn't bluffing. Harrison had given her his personal number years ago when she became one of their most valued clients. Two younger security officers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances. They clearly recognized that Reynolds was out of line, but seemed hesitant to intervene. Is that supposed to impress me? Reynolds sneered. Listen, I've worked security for 20 years. I know when something isn't right, and you don't look like someone who. Who what, Mr. Reynolds? Sarah interrupted, her voice steady but firm. Someone who can afford to fly private. Someone who belongs here. Please, finish your thought. Other passengers had stopped to watch the scene unfold. Some had their phones out, recording the interaction. Sarah spotted Linda Chen, another regular client she often saw at the terminal, shaking her head in disgust at Reynolds' behavior. Captain Anderson finally reached the security desk. Good morning, Ms. Mitchell, he said warmly. Is everything all right here? We're all set for Chicago. Reynolds' face reddened. You know this person? Of course I do, Captain Anderson replied, looking confused. Ms. Mitchell is one of our most frequent flyers. I've personally flown her at least 30 times. The terminal manager, Mr. Peterson, hurried over after being alerted by other staff members. His face showed genuine concern as he took in the situation. Ms. Mitchell, I am so sorry for any inconvenience. Mr. Reynolds is new to our facility. New or not, Sarah said, her voice carrying the weight of years dealing with such prejudice. This kind of treatment is unacceptable. I've been a client here for 15 years, and never have I been treated with such disrespect. Reynolds still wouldn't back down. I'm just doing my job, security protocols. Your job, Mr. Peterson cut in sharply, is to check valid credentials, which Ms. Mitchell has clearly provided, not to make assumptions based on other factors. The tension in the terminal was thick. Other passengers who had witnessed the entire scene were now openly showing their support for Sarah. Linda Chen had walked over and stood beside her, a silent but powerful gesture of solidarity. Sarah checked her watch. Precious minutes had been wasted on this unnecessary confrontation. She had a meeting to get to, and this incident, though infuriating, wouldn't derail her day. Mr. Peterson, she said, her voice clear and professional, I trust you'll handle this appropriately. Now, if there are no other security concerns, I have a flight to catch. The terminal manager nodded quickly, shooting a stern look at Reynolds. As Sarah finally moved past the security checkpoint, she held her head high, dignified despite the humiliation she had just endured. Behind her, she could hear Mr. Peterson telling Reynolds to report to his office immediately. This incident was far from over, but Sarah knew from experience that sometimes the best response to prejudice was success, and she had a crucial meeting in Chicago that wouldn't wait. The next 15 minutes in the private terminal turned into a painful display of systemic racism that Sarah Mitchell had hoped she wouldn't have to face again in 2024. Despite Captain Anderson's confirmation of her identity and Mr. Peterson's intervention, Thomas Reynolds continued to make the situation worse. I still need to run additional security checks, Reynolds insisted, even after his supervisor had told him to stand down. His face was red with either embarrassment or anger, perhaps both. It's standard procedure. Sarah watched as another group of executives walked through security. Reynolds barely glanced at their documents before letting them pass. Each easy passage felt like a slap in the face, highlighting the double standard she was experiencing. Linda Chen, who had remained by Sarah's side, spoke up. "I've been flying from this terminal for 8 years," she said, her voice sharp with anger. "There's no such thing as additional security checks for regular clients. This is pure harassment." More passengers had gathered around, many with their phones recording the scene. Sarah could already imagine the social media storm this would create. As a high-level executive, she had always been careful about her public image. Now, through no fault of her own, she was becoming the center of a viral moment. "Ms. Mitchell," Mr. Peterson said, his forehead beading with sweat, "please, let me personally escort you to your aircraft. Reynolds, report to my office now." But Reynolds wasn't done. He stepped in front of Sarah again, his security badge prominently displayed like a shield. "If she boards that plane without proper verification, I'll have to report this as a security breach." Sarah felt her hands trembling slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Mr. Reynolds," she said, looking him directly in the eyes, "in the time you've spent harassing me, you could have verified my credentials 20 times over. I missed my scheduled departure time, which will impact an important meeting in Chicago. Every minute of this interaction has been recorded by multiple witnesses. Would you like to continue digging this hole deeper?" The terminal had grown unusually quiet. Even the usual announcements seemed muted, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Sarah could see her reflection in the terminal's windows. A successful black woman in a power suit, forced to defend her very presence in a space she had earned the right to occupy. Captain Anderson stepped forward again. "Our flight plan has already been delayed by 20 minutes, he announced loudly. "Ms. Mitchell is a platinum member of our aviation club. Her credentials were verified when she booked the flight, and I can personally vouch for her identity." Two young interns from the terminal's office approached with their badges displayed. "Ms. Mitchell signed our mentor program agreement last month," one of them said. "She's giving the keynote speech at our Aviation Career Day next week." The mounting evidence of Sarah's legitimacy seemed to only make Reynolds more defensive. He stood his ground, though his arguments were becoming increasingly incoherent. Procedures, security protocols. Can't be too careful these days. Sarah's phone buzzed. It was her team in Chicago, wondering about her delay. The humiliation of having to explain this situation to her colleagues, to reschedule a meeting because of one man's prejudice, made her chest tight with anger and frustration. Mr. Peterson finally took decisive action. "Reynolds, your shift is over. Leave your badge at the security office and wait for me there." His voice left no room for argument. As Reynolds finally stepped aside, Sarah could feel dozens of eyes on her. Some held pity, others showed anger on her behalf, and a few reflected shame for not speaking up sooner. She straightened her blazer, gripped her briefcase tighter, and walked toward her gate with as much dignity as she could muster. Linda Chen walked with her, speaking quietly. "This isn't over, Sarah. We all saw what happened here. You can't get away with this." Sarah nodded silently. She had a choice to make now. She could let this incident fade away, becoming just another story of everyday racism, or she could take action. As she finally approached her aircraft, delayed but undefeated, she knew which choice she would make. The challenge now would be channeling this humiliating experience into meaningful change, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been judged, questioned, or blocked from opportunities because of their race. As Sarah Mitchell finally walked toward her private jet, something unexpected happened. Terminal staff members began emerging from their stations. First came Maria Rodriguez, who had worked at the coffee counter for 12 years. She rushed forward with tears in her eyes. "Miss Mitchell," Maria called out, her voice shaking with emotion, "I've served you coffee every Wednesday morning for the past 5 years. You remembered my daughter's graduation and even sent her a card. Please, let me tell them what kind of person you really are." Behind Maria, other staff members appeared. The baggage handlers, cleaning crew, and maintenance workers all stepped forward. Many of them had witnessed similar incidents before, but had felt powerless to speak up. Today was different. "I've loaded Ms. Mitchell's bags hundreds of times," said Tom, a senior baggage handler. "She knows every one of us by name. She brings us Christmas gifts every year." His voice carried across the terminal, where people were still recording the scene on their phones. Mr. Peterson, the terminal manager, was frantically making phone calls. His face had turned pale when he realized just how many witnesses were coming forward. This wasn't just about one security guard anymore. It was becoming a moment of truth for the entire facility. Linda Chen had already started drafting an email to the aviation company's board of directors. As another successful businesswoman, she understood the importance of documenting everything. "Sarah," she said, showing her phone screen, "I have contact information for 3 civil rights attorneys who specialize in aviation cases. What happened today isn't just wrong, it's illegal." Captain Anderson approached with his entire flight crew. "We're ready to file official statements," he announced. "In 15 years of flying, Ms. Mitchell, we've never had a single security issue. What happened today was pure discrimination." Sarah stood quietly, touched by the wave of support, but also exhausted from the confrontation. She watched as more people approached, each with their own story to share about her professionalism and kindness over the years. "Remember when you helped my son get an internship?" Called out Jake from maintenance. "You didn't just give him a chance, you mentored him. Now he's in aviation school, thanks to you." The young interns who had spoken up earlier were now collecting written statements from witnesses. Their hands moved quickly across their tablets, documenting every detail. One of them, a young black woman named Tasha, looked at Sarah with tears in her eyes. "You're the reason I wanted to work in aviation," she said softly. Mr. Peterson returned with more news. "Ms. Mitchell, the company's CEO is on his way. He's canceled his morning meetings and wants to address this situation personally." His voice trembled slightly. "We've also received calls from 3 major news networks." Sarah checked her phone again. Videos of the incident were already spreading across social media. Her own phone was flooded with messages of support from colleagues, clients, and even competitors. The aviation community was small, and word traveled fast. Linda Chen put a gentle hand on Sarah's shoulder. "You don't have to handle this alone," she said firmly. "Look around. Everyone here stands with you." The support was overwhelming, but Sarah knew it wasn't just about her anymore. She thought about other professionals of color who might face similar discrimination. Not everyone had 15 years of connections and a terminal full of witnesses to support them. "Thank you, everyone," Sarah finally said, her voice clear and strong. "Your support means everything. But this isn't just my fight. This is about making sure nobody else has to go through what happened today." As if to emphasize her words, more terminal employees stepped forward. Security officers from other checkpoints approached, ready to report previous incidents they had witnessed. Administrative staff brought out files showing complaint patterns. Even passengers who had never met Sarah personally came forward to share what they had seen. The private aviation terminal had become more than just a place of business. It had become a gathering point for people who were ready to take a stand against discrimination. As Sarah finally boarded her delayed flight, she knew that behind her stood a community ready to fight for change. Her Chicago meeting would have to wait. Sometimes, life presented moments that were bigger than business deals. This was one of them. Within hours of Sarah Mitchell's delayed flight taking off, Elite Aviation's corporate office turned into a hive of activity. The CEO, Robert Thompson, had called an emergency meeting with his executive team. The videos of the incident had gone viral, with millions of views across social media platforms. "I want every piece of security footage from the last 6 months," Thompson ordered, his face stern as he looked around the conference room. Every interaction Reynolds had with passengers, every complaint, everything. The HR director, Janet Lewis, spread out several files on the conference table. "We've already found 3 previous complaints about Reynolds," she said, her voice tight with concern, "all from passengers of color, but none as well documented as today's incident." Security cameras had captured the entire confrontation from multiple angles. On the large screen in the conference room, they watched as Reynolds let white passengers pass while subjecting Sarah to unnecessary scrutiny. The footage was damning. "Look at this," said Michael Chen, the head of security, pointing to another screen. "Reynolds' employment history shows he was dismissed from 2 previous security positions. The reasons weren't listed, but I got calls out to both companies." The investigation team grew larger as the day progressed. They set up a special hotline for other passengers or employees to report similar incidents. The calls started coming in almost immediately. A black executive from Denver reported being questioned unnecessarily last month, an investigator noted, adding to the growing list. And an Indian tech CEO faced similar treatment 2 weeks ago. Sarah's flight landed in Chicago just as the investigation kicked into high gear. Her phone buzzed with a message from Linda Chen. "They're going through everything, Sarah. Your stand today opened the floodgates." The terminal staff continued providing evidence. Maria from the coffee counter brought forward her personal journal, where she had documented concerning incidents she witnessed. The baggage handlers shared stories of overhearing Reynolds make racist comments when he thought no one important was listening. "We found something significant," Janet announced late in the afternoon. Reynolds modified the security check procedures for certain passengers. He created an unofficial additional screening list. She paused, her voice heavy. "The pattern is clear. Almost every person on this list is a person of color." The investigation expanded beyond just Reynolds. The team began reviewing hiring practices, training procedures, and security protocols across all elite aviation facilities. "This isn't just about one bad employee," Thompson said, rubbing his temples. "We need to look at how he was hired, who supervised him, and why these complaints weren't addressed sooner." The young interns who had witnessed the incident were invited to share their observations. Tasha, the intern who had looked up to Sarah, provided a detailed written account of other concerning behavior she had observed during her 3 months at the terminal. By evening, the investigation had uncovered more than just Reynolds' misconduct. They found gaps in their anti-bias training, weaknesses in their complaint reporting system, and a pattern of similar incidents being downplayed or ignored. "I got the preliminary report," Michael announced, placing a thick folder on the CEO's desk. "It's worse than we thought. Reynolds was just the tip of the iceberg. We have systemic issues that need addressing." The social media storm continued growing. Other executives began sharing their own experiences with discrimination in private aviation. What had started as one incident was becoming a movement for industry-wide change. Sarah received another update from Linda. The investigation team has already interviewed 37 people. They're not just looking at Reynolds anymore, they're examining the whole system. Thompson made a decision. "I want a full audit of all our facilities," he announced. "Every terminal, every security checkpoint, every procedure. This stops now." The investigation team worked late into the night. They compiled witness statements, reviewed security footage, and documented patterns of behavior that should have raised red flags long ago. As the day ended, Janet looked at the mountain of evidence they had gathered. "You know what's remarkable?" she said to Thompson. "All of this was happening right under our noses. It took someone like Sarah Mitchell, someone who refused to stay quiet, to make us finally see it." Thompson nodded, picking up his phone to draft an email to Sarah. The investigation was just beginning, but one thing was already clear. Elite aviation would never be the same after today. The consequences of Thomas Reynolds' actions came swiftly and decisively. Just 48 hours after the incident, Elite Aviation CEO Robert Thompson sat at his desk, signing Reynolds' termination papers. But this was only the beginning of the changes sweeping through the private aviation industry. "Reynolds has been terminated, effective immediately," Thompson announced to the board of directors. "But we're not stopping there. This incident has shown us deeper problems that need fixing." Sarah Mitchell's experience had sparked a firestorm. The videos of her confrontation with Reynolds had reached over 20 million views across various social media platforms. Major news networks picked up the story, running headlines like "Discrimination in the Skies" and "Private Aviation's Hidden Bias." Reynolds tried defending himself in a local news interview, but his words only made things worse. "I was just doing my job," he insisted, his face red and defensive. "Security is important." But the interviewer played clip after clip showing him waving white passengers through while stopping people of color for extra screening. The security company that had employed Reynolds faced serious consequences too. Elite Aviation canceled their multi-million-dollar contract immediately. Other aviation companies followed suit, not wanting to risk similar incidents at their facilities. "We've lost 3 major contracts in 2 days," the security company's president admitted to his board. "Reynolds' actions have cost us millions, and our reputation is in shambles." Linda Chen, who had witnessed the incident, used her business connections to spread awareness. "Every private aviation facility needs to look at their security practices," she said during a television interview. "What happened to Sarah Mitchell happens to others every day. She just had the courage and position to fight back." The young interns who had supported Sarah received unexpected recognition. Tasha, in particular, was praised for her bravery in speaking up. Elite Aviation offered her a full-time position after her internship, along with a scholarship to complete her aviation management degree. Ms. Mitchell showed us what real leadership looks like, Tasha said during a staff meeting. She stood up not just for herself, but for everyone who has faced discrimination in this industry. Social media continued to amplify the story. Hashtag Private Aviation Equality started trending, with thousands sharing their own experiences of discrimination in air travel. Major airlines began reviewing their security procedures, worried about similar incidents in their terminals. Reynolds' previous employers finally spoke up. Two other aviation facilities admitted they had dismissed him for similar behavior, but had kept quiet to avoid negative publicity. This revelation led to a broader discussion about the practice of quietly dismissing problematic employees who could then move on to other companies. "We should have spoken up sooner," admitted one of Reynolds' former supervisors. "By staying quiet, we allowed this behavior to continue elsewhere. That stops now." The financial impact hit hard. Elite Aviation's insurance company raised their rates, citing increased risk. The security company that employed Reynolds faced multiple lawsuits, and their stock price dropped by 30% in a week. Sarah's company stood firmly behind her. They issued a strong statement condemning discrimination and announced they would only work with aviation companies that could demonstrate strong anti-bias policies and training. "What happened to our senior VP is unacceptable," her CEO stated publicly. "We're reviewing all our travel contracts to ensure our employees fly with companies that respect diversity." Maria, the coffee counter worker who had supported Sarah, received a promotion to customer service manager. Her detailed documentation of previous incidents proved invaluable to the investigation. "Sometimes standing up for what's right brings unexpected blessings," she said, smiling through tears at her promotion ceremony. Reynolds himself faced more than just job loss. His actions had made him virtually unemployable in the aviation industry. His security license came under review, and his face became synonymous with the type of discrimination that had no place in modern aviation. As the week ended, Thompson signed one final document, a new company-wide anti-discrimination policy with real teeth. Reynolds lost more than his job, Thompson reflected. He became the example of what happens when bias and discrimination go unchecked. But more importantly, he became the catalyst for real change. The consequences continued to ripple through the industry, touching everyone from security guards to CEOs. What started as one man's prejudice had triggered a transformation that would reshape private aviation's approach to equality and justice. 1 month after the incident with Thomas Reynolds, Elite Aviation's main terminal looked very different. New signs in multiple languages welcomed all passengers. Security staff wore body cameras, and clear instructions about passenger rights were displayed prominently. But these visible changes were just the beginning. In the terminal's newly created training room, 20 security officers sat watching a video. On the screen, Sarah Mitchell herself spoke about her experience. She had agreed to help create Elite Aviation's new training program, turning her painful experience into a teaching tool. "Today, we're going to learn about unconscious bias," instructor said, pausing the video, "and how it can affect our judgment even when we think we're being fair." The changes went far beyond just one terminal. Elite Aviation had implemented a comprehensive transformation program that was quickly becoming the industry standard. Maria Rodriguez, now the customer experience manager, led morning briefings with security teams. "Remember," she told them, "every passenger deserves the same respect, regardless of how they look or what they wear." The young intern Tasha, who had supported Sarah during the incident, was now running the company's new mentorship program. "We're focusing on bringing more diversity into private aviation," she explained to a group of high school students visiting the facility. "This industry should reflect all the people it serves." Elite Aviation CEO Robert Thompson had made diversity and inclusion his top priority. He hired Dr. Angela Carter, a respected expert in organizational change, as the company's first chief diversity officer. "We're not just changing rules," Dr. Carter announced during a staff meeting. "We're changing the culture of private aviation. Every employee, from baggage handlers to pilots, must complete our new training program." The changes included practical reforms, too. New security checkpoints had multiple cameras and always required 2 officers to be present. Every security decision needed clear documentation, and monthly audits checked for any patterns of bias. Linda Chen, who had witnessed the original incident, helped create a passenger advocacy group. We meet monthly to review security practices and suggest improvements, she explained. Having passengers involved in the process keeps everyone accountable. The terminal's coffee shop, where Maria had worked for years, became a symbol of the new culture. Its walls now displayed photos of aviation pioneers from diverse backgrounds, including the first black pilots and female aviation executives. "Look at this," Tasha said, pointing to a new digital board in the terminal. It showed real-time statistics about security checks, ensuring no racial or gender disparities in screening times. Complete transparency, that's our new standard. The changes affected hiring practices too. Elite Aviation now required diverse interview panels for all positions. Background checks became more thorough, specifically looking for past incidents of discrimination. "We check references more carefully now," Janet from HR explained. "We contact previous employers and ask specific questions about a candidate's behavior toward diverse groups." The company also created a new mobile app where passengers could rate their experience and report concerns instantly. Any pattern of complaints triggered immediate investigation. Captain Anderson, who had supported Sarah during the incident, now led pilot training sessions about creating inclusive environments. "Our job isn't just flying planes," he told new pilots. "It's making sure every passenger feels respected and welcome." Even the physical space changed. The terminal's waiting areas now featured magazines and art representing diverse cultures. Signs appeared in multiple languages, and prayer rooms were added for passengers of different faiths. The security company that had employed Reynolds underwent its own transformation. They hired new leadership and completely rebuilt their training program. "What happened with Sarah Mitchell was our wake-up call," the new CEO admitted. "We had to change everything." One particularly meaningful change came in the form of scholarships. Elite Aviation created the Mitchell Leadership Program, offering opportunities for minority students interested in aviation careers. Sarah herself visited the terminal regularly to check on the changes. During one visit, she met a young black female pilot trainee who hugged her with tears in her eyes. "Because of you," the young woman said, "I know I belong here." Dr. Carter summed up the transformation during an industry conference. "What happened to Sarah Mitchell was terrible, but from that moment of discrimination came real change. We're building an aviation industry where everyone can fly with dignity." The changes weren't perfect, and there was still work to be done, but month by month, flight by flight, Elite Aviation was proving that transformation was possible when people committed to real change. 1 year after the incident that changed private aviation, Sarah Mitchell stood at a podium in Elite Aviation's main terminal. Behind her, a large banner read, "First Annual Aviation Equality Summit." The terminal was packed with industry leaders, employees, and media representatives. "When I walked into this terminal a year ago," Sarah began, her voice strong and clear, "I faced discrimination that no passenger should ever experience. Today, I stand here not as a victim, but as a catalyst for change." The changes that started at Elite Aviation had spread across the entire private aviation industry. 25 major companies had adopted the Mitchell Standards, a comprehensive set of guidelines for ensuring equal treatment of all passengers. In the audience, Linda Chen smiled proudly. Her investment firm now required all aviation partners to follow these standards. Next to her sat Tasha, no longer an intern but a full-time aviation operations manager, wearing her company badge with pride. "Look how far we've come," Maria Rodriguez whispered to her colleague. As Customer Experience Director, she now managed customer service training for all Elite Aviation terminals nationwide. Her documentation of past incidents had helped create the new industry guidelines. The numbers told a powerful story. Complaints about discrimination in private aviation had dropped by 70%. More importantly, passenger surveys showed increased trust and satisfaction across all demographic groups. Dr. Angela Carter, Elite Aviation's Chief Diversity Officer, presented the annual report. "In 1 year, we've trained over 5,000 aviation professionals. We've implemented new security protocols at 128 terminals. But numbers don't tell the whole story. The real change is in our culture." Thomas Reynolds' story had become a cautionary tale in aviation security training. His name wasn't mentioned anymore, but his actions served as a powerful example of how bias could destroy careers and damage entire organizations. The security company that employed Reynolds filed for bankruptcy last month, Linda mentioned quietly to Sarah after the speech. Their failure to address discrimination cost them everything. The Mitchell Leadership Program had already awarded scholarships to 50 students from underrepresented groups. Many of them attended the summit, wearing their program pins proudly. Among them was James Turner, a young black man who had already earned his pilot's license. "Ms. Mitchell," James said during the Q&A session, "your stand that day showed us that we don't have to accept discrimination. We can fight it and win." Captain Anderson, now Elite's Director of Flight Operations, presented data showing increased diversity among flight crews. "Our passengers now see themselves reflected in our staff at every level," he reported proudly. The terminal itself had become a model for others. Clear signs explained passenger rights in multiple languages. Security checkpoints had transparent protocols and recording systems. Regular audits ensured consistent treatment for all passengers. Sarah's own career had soared. Her company had promoted her to executive vice president, and she now served on several aviation industry boards. But more importantly, she had become a symbol of positive change. The hardest part that day, Sarah shared during her closing remarks, wasn't facing discrimination. It was deciding to take a stand. But look what happened because we refused to stay silent. The young security officers who had witnessed the original incident but felt helpless to intervene were now trainers themselves. They taught new officers how to recognize and prevent discrimination. Elite Aviation CEO Robert Thompson announced the company's next step, an industry-wide certification program for aviation equality. The Mitchell certification will become the gold standard for private aviation, he declared. After the summit, Sarah walked through the terminal where everything had started. She passed the coffee counter where Maria had first spoken up, the security checkpoint where Reynolds had tried to block her, and the spot where fellow passengers had started recording. A new plaque on the wall caught her eye. It read, "On this spot in 2024, one woman's courage changed an industry. May we never forget that justice requires both voice and action." Tasha approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. "You know what's different now?" she said softly. "When people like me walk into this terminal, we know we belong here. That's your real legacy." As Sarah prepared to board her flight home that evening, she reflected on how one difficult moment had transformed into a movement. The discrimination she faced hadn't broken her. It had sparked a revolution in private aviation. "Safe travels, Ms. Mitchell," called out the security officer at the checkpoint, following the new protocols perfectly. Sarah smiled, knowing that somewhere, a young person of color would walk into this terminal tomorrow and be treated with the dignity they deserved.